third session on leadership influence for internal communication specialists. We are Russell Olivia Brooklands, and if you're new to these sessions, then just a quick heads up that we refer to ourselves in the plural because we have a rare medical condition, which means our body works better when we do. It also means that we process the world in a slightly tangential way, which is useful for identifying cultural blind spots, which have seemingly been keeping an awful lot of the leadership influence sort of on hold for a very long time. So we hope that today we're going to be able to help you to get through some of those blind spots. And if you've been on any of the other sessions, then welcome back and thank you for joining us again. So today, what we're going to be looking at are two key issues. First of all, how do you put together the business case for securing all the leadership influence you want? And secondly, how do you put together an action plan? Because it's all very well having the business case, but unless you're able to implement things, then it's still not going to work, is it? So the action plan, as well as the business case, what we'll be pulling together in this session. And because we realize that, well, you know, if people are going to put this into practice, they need to feel, and if you've been on either of the other sessions, you'll know how into justifiable confidence we are. So how do you have justifiable confidence to actually use the stuff we're going to be sharing with you, given that well, actually, what we're sharing over these three sessions is the accumulated knowledge and experience and research and development, whatever, that we've been putting together over the course of the last 30 years, which means you'll effectively have been getting like a decade's worth of R&D crammed into a single hour, each of the 3 hours that we've been together. So that might make you feel, okay, can I actually do this? Because Brooklands makes it look so simple and so straightforward, but then he has been doing it for 3 decades. So we decided that it might be useful at the end if we were to offer you a little workshop to make it as easy as peasy to actually use this stuff. Because if you're not going to use it, then, you know, what's the point? So we'll share that with you at the end. So before we get on to that, though, let's talk about the first issue, getting yourself the business case together to actually get the leadership influence you're after. How do you do that? Well, it's something that people have been trying to do for, well, since the beginning of the century at least. And despite all the sort of progress and so on, the internal communications made over that time, that leadership influence still isn't anything like people want it to be. Why not? What's stopping it? What's getting in the way? And it transpires that maybe people are coming at it in slightly the wrong way, because all over the place we see people offering services to how to measure your impact and talking about it on LinkedIn, how to measure your impact and prove your value and all this kind of stuff. And it hasn't worked. Why not? What's the problem here? And it turns out that when we ask people, okay, so you're doing all these measurements, right? Now, what do you want to be able to do or not do as a result of having measured, having provided those measurements to your leadership team? What's going on now? And this is when people talk about, well, they talk about wanting to have more influence. They talk about having more opportunities, about not having to do stuff they don't want to be doing, about getting a bigger team or whatever it is. The thing is, it doesn't really matter what the details are. What they're after, what everyone seems to be after as a result of doing this measurement, is some kind of change to the status quo. Of course they do. Why go to all the trouble and effort and of actually doing all these measurements if you don't want anything to change as a result? Which means that what people are expecting is that their measuring is going to provide a catalyst for change. Okay, sounds cool enough. However, if all you're doing is measuring the value of what you're already doing, where's the catalyst for change? You're already worth that much without changing anything. So it's kind of a doomed enterprise, really. And what you actually need to do in order to get the management influence you want, the leadership influence you want, is not necessarily measuring the value you're already worth, but your untapped potential. How much more could you be worth to your leadership team, to your organization, if you were given all the influence you're after and all the other resources you're after? And people listen to that and they think, well, hang on a second, that's mad. How on earth am I supposed to prove the value of what I'm not doing? Now, you can't do that. Actually, you can. And we're going to show you how you can do it over the course of this session. But it does mean taking into account another cultural blind spot that many people seem, they kind of got it, but kind of haven't, which is the fact that internal communication is interwoven through every other business activity, which means it is absolutely impossible to point to any business success and say that only happened because of effective internal communication. You can't do that. But what people can do, and what they very often do, is point to failures, business failures, project failures, and say that happened because of poor internal communication. People didn't know about X. They didn't understand about Y. The message didn't get through about Z. That's why it's failed. And if that's the case, which it is, why don't we work with that reality? What would happen if we were to use that reality and turn it on its head and make use of it, rather than just sort of ignoring it or going, why don't we make use of that reality to get the influence you want? How can you do that? Well, what if you were able to demonstrate your ability, your untapped potential to reduce, and bear with us on this one, it's going to sound mad when we first say it perhaps, but what if you were able to prove your ability to reduce internal communication costs? Yeah. Doesn't sound very sexy, does it? And you might think, what the heck would I want to do that for? I'm under enough pressure as it is. I don't want my budget slashed even more. I don't want to lose members of my team. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a distinction which we were gifted many, many years ago by the brilliant Sarah Karen. If you don't know Sarah, she's absolutely wonderful. And we were having lunch with her one day and talking about internal communication costs. And we were rambling on about stuff. And she sort of sat there on the other side of the table and said, hang on a minute, Rob, are they all costs that you're talking about? Are not some of those investments? And we felt like a real Homer Simpson at that point. Oh, for goodness sake, she's absolutely right. So we went away and we did some thinking about the distinction between internal communication investments and internal communication costs. And this is something your leadership team may never have done. They may talk about, cutting communication costs, but actually they're talking about cutting investments, which, as we shall demonstrate, is almost bound to increase internal communication costs. So what is the distinction? It's dead simple. Internal communication investments are necessary. You can't not make them. Okay. Whereas internal communication costs are all unnecessary. They are needless waste. So what we're going to share with you is, first of all, the distinction between the investments and costs. And we'll take you through a whole series of slides here, because a lot of people find it easy to remember stuff and recall it if they can see it as well as hear it at the same time. And we'll walk you through those investments and costs, and then show you how you can use this to demonstrate your untapped potential in a way which your leadership team are probably going to find quite useful. So let's first of all go through the investments. There are three of them. First of all, your budget. Okay, no surprises there. There's also production time. And that's your time, but it's also the time of your clients and any approval group members. And it's also beyond that. What about all the people who are writing emails, the time they spend actually putting those together or putting together presentations and so on? All of that production time is what we're talking about. And then, of course, because it's internal communication, there's also the audience's time that needs to be paid for. So you can see very obviously your organization cannot not make these investments. They are necessary, but they can often be unnecessarily high because of internal communication costs. And there are different types. There are two different types of costs. First of all, there are what we would call the wasteful costs, such as happen when people move the goalposts. No doubt you have been involved in projects. Sometimes we have a client who starts off wanting one thing and then halfway through they think, oh, actually I want to change my mind and oh, for goodness sake, and you just had some of your time wasted. But it's not only your time, it's also when people are trying to put together presentations for their own meetings or whatever, and they change their minds about what they want to do or what they want to write in an email. And all of that is moving goalposts. And then sometimes the goalposts don't get moved, they get removed. You do a whole load of work on a project and suddenly it's a case of, oh, we're not doing that at all now. Oh, brilliant. Thanks. So all of that time has gone down the drain. And then, of course, there is the wasted audience time. Whole stacks of it, because people are receiving emails they don't need and can't use. They're in meetings that don't need to happen. There are all sorts of other things that are going on that are wasting their time. So those are three wasteful costs, but they often pale into insignificance against the other costs which can arise when internal communications fail. The failure costs are really significant. First of all, well, if a communication has failed, chances are, excuse us, if it's failed, chances are it's probably going to have to be done again. So the repeat communications, which means incurring those three investments a second time around and maybe a third time around if it fails again. And then, of course, there's the problem of the mistakes and misunderstandings that can arise if people haven't got the right information, if they haven't been told X, Y, or Z, or it wasn't accurate or whatever. So those can cost huge amounts of time. And then there's the question of, well, hang on a second, all the time that people are spending receiving communications they never needed in the first place, and then the repeat communications and correcting the mistakes and misunderstandings, they're not actually getting on with the day job. All the opportunities to either generate additional revenue or identify and realize cost savings, they are all being missed. And then there's the emotional impact of all of this. Employee disengagement. Now, of course, employee disengagement is not just an internal communication thing, but let's not pretend that internal communication can't contribute anything to disengagement. And when people get disengaged, then maybe they can end up sort of throwing sickies, or they may just feel genuinely stressed out. They don't know what's going on and whatever. And so they suffer from genuine stress-related illnesses. Or sometimes people just walk out the door, which increases recruitment and training costs. So it all starts to mushroom and mushroom and mushroom from there. And then, of course, there's what happens as a result of those mistakes and misunderstandings. And the disengagement, well, if the employees are disengaged, maybe some of them are going to start bad-mouthing the organization on social media. Or if it's mistakes that are happening with customers, then quite possibly they're going to be complaining on social media, which is going to damage the brand. And finally, what can happen is if communications keep failing and keep failing and keep failing, then either the organization itself or a particular department can simply fail to fulfill its very purpose. Department-wise, it tends to be most obvious when it's the IT department. Actually, they're the ones who get it in the neck most. When the IT department has failed, then everybody knows about it because they can't really hide. But sometimes maybe the entire organization just fails to fulfill its purpose. If that's happening with a commercial organization, well, they're just going to go out of business eventually. But if it's a public sector organization, well, they can't go out of business, so they could just keep on failing year after year after year. So these are some very serious costs. Sure, you can appreciate that. And if we return from here to a concept we talked about in the last session, where we're talking about you being able to make your working practices transparently fit for valid purposes. Remember, the purpose of the practice needs to be valid as opposed to invalid. It needs to be fit rather than unfit for that purpose, because as we can see, the alternatives to practices being transparently fit for valid purposes are simply unacceptable. They're indefensible. And we can now see that also that's where these costs reside, in practices which are transparently unfit or transparently fit only for invalid purposes, and so on and so forth. So we know, if we look at these costs, they are telling you that at least some of your organization's internal communication practices are transparently unfit. And this in turn can give you that catalyst for change to move your practices ever more into that transparently fit for valid purposes sector. Hope this is making sense to you, because the question then arises is, okay, how do you measure these costs in a way which is credible? Because if you're going to get your leadership team on board, then obviously you need to be able to show them, okay, well, how much is this costing? Otherwise, it's just a kind of an academic idea. It's an academic principle. But the trouble we've already identified is that, well, internal communication is interwoven through every other business activity. So how can you measure any of these things clean? Well, there are a couple that you can measure clean. First of all, wasted audience time. Obviously, you can say, yeah, no question. And then there's also mistakes and misunderstandings. Now, some people might say, yeah, but mistakes can happen because people either weren't motivated to do it properly or they didn't have the skills to do it. But if you think about that, well, hang on a second. Why are they not motivated? Or why have they been given responsibilities that they're not qualified to actually discharge? If you track it back far enough, you'll find there will be internal communication failures that have happened somewhere that have given rise to those. So that being the case, let's think about how can we actually make this something that you can share effectively with your leadership team? How can you measure these things in a way that they can have justifiable confidence in? Well, there are really two pieces of information you need in order to do it. First of all, you need to know how much is it costing per hour to employ people in different roles. So, that's the first thing. And your business will already have, your organization will already have that information. Someone in finance, HR, payroll, someone somewhere will know how many people there are at different salary grades and how much it costs per hour on average to employ people at those grades. The information is there already. You don't have to actually work that out. The second thing you need to do that you do need to research is, okay, how many hours are people losing in different salary bands, doing different jobs and whatever? And if you can put that together with the cost per hour, hey presto, you know how much time is going down the drain as a result of at least some of the costs of those practices which are transparently unfit. And we put together a tool to make this possible. We put it together back in 2009. We've been doing this for yonks. And when people signed up for this session, we invited them to get involved in a sort of fantasy IC financial audit, because we wanted to be able to show you a real example of how this works and how easy it is to demonstrate the kind of value you are sitting on. So when people signed up for this, we invited them, if they were willing, to take on the role of a sort of a representative of an employee group in this fantasy organization with 5,000 employees, because some people are working in organizations with 500, some in organizations with 80,000. So we thought, well, 5,000 is sort of a reasonable kind of representative figure. And some people obviously were too busy to get involved, and others put their hands up and say, yeah, I'll do that. Cool. So we're going to show you now what happens when you put together the information about how much it's costing to employ people per hour and how much time it's actually costing them to do, get involved in practices which are transparently unfit. So this tool that we put together is called Realize. And the first thing we just want to show you, and this is not something you would have to do because your payroll people or someone somewhere has already got this, but just so you get the background to it, we split the organization up into 5 groups. A lot of organizations have sort of fairly flat structures nowadays. So, but you could, if you needed to, for your organization, have 10 groups, 15 groups, or whatever is appropriate for your organization. And we split them up like this. So there are frontline staff, and then there are different people in different management grades. They aren't necessarily line managers, all of them. Some of them will be technical specialists in marketing and IT and whatever, but they're being paid, at a management level. And we split them up like that because, first of all, frontline people. So in service business, there would be people in a call center. In a manufacturing business, they'll be on a factory floor. In a retail business, be on a shop floor. We know that people doing those sorts of jobs aren't spending huge amounts of time in internal communication activities, whereas a project manager will find themselves very often in back-to-back meetings all day kind of thing. So management grades tend to be spending an awful lot more time communicating and being communicated with. So that's why we split it up in this way. And obviously they will also be being paid different amounts of money. So the cost per hour is going to be different. So we sort of split up the 5,000 staff like this. And then we were asking people who were taking part in this survey, if you were in this role, how much do you reckon that the salary would be for someone in this role in your organization or in this fantasy organization? So they gave us this money or these numbers. And then we were able to take these numbers and do the kind of stuff that the payroll people do. How many hours per week are they working? How much annual leave have they got? How much does it cost for insurances and office space and equipment and bonuses and all that kind of stuff? You wouldn't need to do this. It's already there in your organization, but this has given us an hourly cost. So we know, okay, this is how much it's costing to employ different people in different roles in this organization. Tick. Now, let's get into the surveys. Dead simple to find out from people how much time it's costing. And what's important here, if you look at that title, the current inherited paradigm, that means that when doing these surveys, it's critical to point out to people it's okay to be truthful about this, because however much time is being wasted, it's not your fault. It's the fault of the inherited paradigm. You're not to blame. So you don't need to feel bad about it. You don't need to feel guilty or ashamed or defensive. Just tell us what's going on so we know what's actually happening in the organization. So it's really important to give people a sense of safety, that they can be truthful about what's going on with them. So we're asking, okay, number one, in an average week, how many hours are you spending reading internal emails? And of that time, how much of it is being wasted because you've been sent stuff you don't need and can't use? Straightforward enough. Similarly with meetings, how many hours are you spending in a month in a typical meeting? We use monthly figures for meetings because the frontline people may go through a whole week without having a single meeting. So it's easier to do it over a period of a month. And again, what percentage of that time is being wasted because either the meeting didn't need to happen or it just went round and round in circles and no decisions were taken and blah, 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 blah. And then How much time in a typical month are you spending struggling to find information that you need, whether it's on the intranet or in SharePoints or elsewhere? How much time are you struggling with that? Maybe the intranet is struggling because things aren't as well signposted as they could be, or some of the links are broken, or whatever. And in SharePoints, maybe someone has put something back in the wrong folder, and the kind of thing that goes on. And then when it comes to your own communicating, we're asking people, how many hours are you typically spending, staring at a blank screen, chewing your knuckles, trying to work out what to put in your own communications, whether they are emails or their presentations you're putting together. And yes, things like ChatGPT may have made it easier for people to put content together. However, very often, as you probably know yourself, if you use those sorts of tools that you put in prompts and then it'll come back with a load of garbage and you think, oh, for goodness sake, it's not even close to what we need. So you have to go again and go again. So how many hours are people spending struggling with that? And then finally, the mistakes and the misunderstandings. How many hours are people having to spend doing that, either correcting their own mistakes because they didn't have the right information to not make those mistakes, or other people's mistakes because they didn't have the right information? So very simple questions. It will take no more than a couple of minutes for people to complete these surveys. And then we can start looking at, okay, so what's the business impact that we're able to see as a result of this? When we gather all this information together, and what we found with the particular survey we ran here was that the numbers we got back were very slightly higher than we normally see. By no means outside the bell curve, but a little higher than we would normally see. When we first look at, okay, how many hours per employee per year are going down the drain? Now, for non-frontline staff, it's usually a little bit closer to a couple of hundred hours a year, but this is by no means outrageous. We've seen far worse than this. And what's also interesting is that it's always the middle managers that seem to be squeezed. They're the ones that seem to come off worst because they're being squeezed from above and below, and they're the ones who are losing the greatest amount of time. And we're also able to see, okay, what is this costing per employee per year as a result of this? And these figures are perhaps quite interesting in themselves, but what the leadership team are probably going to want to know from you is, okay, what's the impact across the organization as a whole? Now, in this organization with fantasy organization, fantasy figures that have been put in, this is just to illustrate the point. In this organization with 5,000 employees, they are losing currently, according to what we've got, 721,000 working hours a year. And what is that costing? Well, it's costing £31.6 million. Now, when you first see that, you might think, whoa, that's impressive. But in an organization of 5,000 employees, that's maybe relatively small beer. But that's not the point. The point is, how much investment would you need in order to be able to kick a significant hole in that? That's the key point. This is the catalyst for change stuff that we're talking about. Being able to say, you know what, if you just give us a little bit more time, a little bit more resource, more authority, more opportunities, we can actually start to make a significant dent in this issue. This is how you're demonstrating your untapped potential. And what we found when we first started doing this was that some leadership teams would say, oh, yes, we definitely need to do something about this, maybe next quarter or next year. So we've also found it useful to point out, okay, but you do realize that every single day you delay doing something about this is costing another, in this case, 126,000 quid. And chances are you're going to be asking for only a tiny fraction of, or not a tiny fraction of the 126,000, but a tiny fraction of the amount of impact you'd be able to have, maybe 2 or 3 days worth of the daily costs that you'd need to have invested in order to be able to make that kind of difference, maybe even less than that. So first thing, or the next thing we need to look at is, so where would the impact need to happen? Where are these hours actually disappearing? So we can see that as well. In this particular example, we've got nearly 250,000 hours going on needless emails, another 250,000 on the mistakes and misunderstandings, whole huge chunk on the unproductive meeting time. Fine. Okay, so what kind of impact could you have on that? And this is where we have been using the same figures really ever since 2009, and we very often get criticized for the figures that we use because people say, you're way too conservative, Brooklands, and we say, yes, quite possibly we are, but we feel it's important to err on the side of caution rather than trying to make grandiose claims about how much impact you can have. So if you think our figures are way too low, well, fine. You could, if you were to do something like this yourself, you could put in your own figures and see what it turns out like. And similarly, if you share this kind of stuff with your leadership team, they would be able to put in their figures so that they become increasingly invested in what's going on here. So what we say is that when it comes to the time being wasted on needless emails, well, everyone else is writing those emails, so you might not have much impact on that at all, but not zero impact, but pretty close to it. So we just say 0.05%. As we say, incredibly conservative. But then, as you'll discover, you don't need to go over the top with this because the numbers are so huge. So how about meeting time? Well, again, most of those meetings, pretty much all of them, are being run by other people. So you're not going to have that much impact. But we have included cascades in this. So we've increased that to 1%. Again, you may think we've underestimated, but that's what we've done. When it comes to searching for information, well, that was one of the smaller pieces of the pie, wasn't it? But it's one of the pieces over which you no doubt will have a bigger impact. So, but maybe not as much impact as you might think. Maybe a lot of that time is going on the SharePoints over which you don't have maybe that much control. We don't know. So in this particular example, we've said 35% that you would be able to save of that. When it comes to the time people agonizing over what to communicate, well, if you're improving the quality of that raw material, that base raw material that people are getting to work with, maybe you could have a bit more of an impact on that. So we're saying 4%. And when it comes to the rework, well, if the line managers, other managers, project leaders and all that kind of stuff are working with better quality raw materials so that everyone's getting the incremental improvements are happening across the piece, we're daring to suggest this could be as high, not that it's very high, as 12%. So these are the figures that we use, and you may disagree with all of them, but the important point is, again, this is just for illustration purposes. And what would that mean your untapped potential is worth? Just you and your team. In this particular organization, nearly 48,000 working hours. If you were just able to make your working practices transparently fit for valid purposes, 1.85 million pounds worth of payback year on year. That's what we're looking at. That's how easy it can be to demonstrate, why on earth wouldn't you let us just do things in a way which is transparently fit for valid purposes? And this is just the beginning of the story, because this is just your impact, you and your team. But as we said earlier, so many managers are crying out for support to be more effective communicators. What if you were able to put together some practices which they were able to follow? If they were communicating in a way which is transparently fit for valid purposes as well, then in addition to your impact, they could really be making quite a big chunky difference on those needless emails and the meeting time and so on and so forth, such that your ability to contribute to the bottom line would go up significantly. Now we're looking at 226,000 working hours. Again, remember, an organization with 5,000 employees, and closer to 10 million in terms of the payback. And this is only the beginning, because what about all those other soft benefits that could come through as a result, like the emotional benefits for your organization's employees, the people on the receiving end of communications, which are clearer and more timely and so on. First of all, they are far likely to be able to feel they have more trust in what they're being told, but also it's likely to give rise to fewer misunderstandings, the emotional impact of misunderstandings and people getting angry with each other and so on because they haven't quite read what each other are talking about. And then what about the communicators? If they are able to follow TFVP practices, then first of all, the whole having to fake it till they make it or cross their fingers and hope stuff falls away, which means imposter syndrome has nowhere to hide anymore. There's no reason for that. And if managers are feeling justifiably confident in how they're communicating with their people, then maybe some of that drive for micromanaging could fall away as well. And that's good. And then, well, both communicators and internal audiences, if everybody has got this increasing sense of shared justifiable confidence in how everything's being done, that's bound to have a beneficial impact on everyone's sense of psychological safety, which in the current environment is surely something that your leadership team are probably going to think that would be good, wouldn't it? But that's just the emotional impact. There are also legal implications of this. If people are making fewer mistakes, then surely that's going to mean that there are likely to be fewer regulatory fines or less risk of regulatory fines and lawsuits. That's another benefit. And then there's the reputational angle of it. If you've got happier employees, chances are they're going to be feeling better disposed towards customers and so on, happier, smilier. And also, if they're better informed, they're going to be less likely to be making mistakes, which is going to make customers happier as well. And then there are still some more financial benefits, the hidden financial benefits of this. First of all, If you've got employees that are better informed and they're having less of their time wasted with stuff they don't need and can't use, they will have more quality thinking time and better quality raw material with which to identify opportunities to generate additional revenue or identify and realize cost savings. And then there's the question of what it means when they are happier and better informed. Is it possible that might have a beneficial impact on stress-related illnesses? So fewer people are feeling stressed and so on. Fewer people are going off sick. Lower need for overtime to cover sick pay or whatever, kind of sick leave and so on. And then also fewer people perhaps throwing sickies and fewer people walking out the door, which is going to have a beneficial impact as far as recruitment and training costs are concerned. And finally, if people are working with better quality raw material, they're able to make better decisions and there's less need for red tape. So there are some huge, significant benefits that you can derive from being able to demonstrate to your leadership team, hey, you know what? All we're asking for is simply to be allowed to make our working practices transparently fit for valid purposes, because we can see now at least some of the measurable costs of not doing that. And we can see the benefits that we could actually add to the organization if we were allowed to simply do the job the way it needs doing, if you would give us the right to do that. So having done that, we then need an action plan, of course, because, okay, you make your business case, say, chances are the leadership team are going to say, yeah, we get this, but how are you going to make it happen? How are you going to realize that untapped potential? So we need an action plan to do that. And there are two things we need to share with you about the action plan. First of all, what does that action plan actually need to deliver for you? And secondly, how do you implement it? So what needs to be in that action plan? So an action plan, we would suggest, needs to be put together such that you can make all of your working practices transparently fit for valid purposes, because that's where the heart of your influence lies, in our view. And it will do that in such a way that it can enable everyone to share justifiable confidence in everything that's happening within your organization. So everyone has that. And in doing that, you can actually secure all the leadership influence that you're after for the rest of your career. So this is it. How do we put together an action plan for making all of your practices TFVP so that you are able to get all the leadership influence you're after? And there are 7 points to this. First of all, and the first one is dead simple, all you need to do to begin with is just list all of your current working practices. What are they? What are all the different things that you do, such as, okay, you've got a briefing process and you've probably got a channel mix that you manage, and you've got some language standards. Maybe you don't have any language standards, but maybe you do. Perhaps you have some enterprise social network protocols that you're responsible for. Perhaps there's an approvals and sign-off process. You coordinate stuff with the external comms team. You've got a message calendar. In our experience, most internal communication teams have somewhere between about 10 and 15 working practices that they're using. Some of them formally documented, some of them not. But the idea is that you should list every single one of them. And as you go through them, you prioritize. Okay, what's the first one we're going to look at? What's the second? And so on. You keep working through, make your list of, right, this is the order in which we're going to do things. Now, that's important because as you work through them, it's going to take you time. You're not going to be able to do this in 5 minutes. Chances are, as we mentioned last time, it's probably going to be best part of a couple of years to actually work through all of them one by one and embed them all properly and make sure they're all working. However, because you're going through them one at a time systematically, then it means that you should be able to start seeing the benefits come through by the time you've done your first practice. That should get you more leadership influence, and the second one should get you more influence still, and so on and so forth. So it starts to build up really quite quickly. So how do we actually do this? First of all, evaluating each of those practices. You get to it on your list, right? How transparently fit for valid purposes is this practice? And we need to think about, okay, how do you do that? First of all, you define the purpose of each practice. Have you actually got it written down at the moment? What is the purpose of your briefing process? What is the purpose of your language standards, of your message calendar? Have you written down an explicit purpose to that? Maybe not. Time to do that, to say what that purpose is. And then, because it needs to be transparently fit for valid purposes, you need to validate that purpose against the transparently valid purpose of internal communication, which we shared with you last time. And if you disagree with that, then fine, we would love to have a conversation with you about how you could make our transparently valid purpose even more valid still. But of course, rules of the game, you need to show your workings out. And then once you've got a valid purpose, it's time to question how fit for that purpose is this practice, both in terms of its design and also your ability and everyone else's ability to implement that. How do you do that? How do you assess that fitness? Well, we already talked about this again in the last session when we went through those minimum hygiene criteria. Remember the trace criteria, which are telling us that any internal communication practice can be considered fit only if what's coming out the back end of it is timely, relevant, accurate, clear, engaging, logically organized, accessible, complete, and ethical. Because if it ain't, then it's not transparently fit for valid purposes. And what's fascinating about this is that not every criterion is relevant to every practice. So, for example, with language standards, well, timeliness isn't really relevant to that, but clarity sure as heck is. You know, if people are using vague, abstract corporate speak or jargon, well, that's not acceptable, is it? That's going to be unclear and that's not going to work. Also, are your language standards guaranteeing that your communications are engaging, or is it still the case that some people might be reading things and thinking, hang on a second, is this talking to me? Is it talking to someone else? Because it feels like it's talking to someone else now, even though I thought it's supposed to be for me. And when you have that experience, you know, you've been the communication, it fails. And hey, guess what? Internal communication failure costs. And of course, it also needs to be ethical. You know, you can't use abusive language or things like that. So these are minimum hygiene criteria that are relevant to language standards, but they're not really relevant to, let's say, your channel mix. But timeliness, sure as heck is. People need to know that they can access whatever they need, whenever they need it, wherever they happen to be at the time. It also needs to be logically organized. It needs to be accessible. So you can go through each of your practices and evaluate them against the different minimum hygiene criteria, see which ones are relevant, and then check how well does your practice currently support those minimum hygiene criteria. And of course, as always, show everyone your workings out so they can have justifiable confidence in it. So that means once you've done the evaluation, obviously you need to update those practices as necessary, which means both in terms of the working procedures and templates that you're using, but also because it's not just about the design, it's about the implementation, which means you may need some new business policies. So that even if you have, got this new squeaky clean briefing process, but if you still got clients who can play the old, I can only give you 5 minutes card, it's not going to work. You need to have business policies which will support you in actually implementing these effectively. Then when you've got those, then of course, it will be necessary to identify the resources. What's it going to take for people to be able to actually do this? It's all very well having the new procedures, having the new business policies, but if people haven't got what it takes to do it, it ain't going to happen. You need to have the right resources, you and your team, but so too do your clients need to have that, and the approval groups. They need to have the right resources. And eventually, if you're going to share these with line managers, they need to have the right resources as well. So how do we actually go about doing that? Well, if we go back to the whole issue of making practices transparently fit for valid purposes, there's something really fascinating that happens when we share this with leadership teams and they recognize, hang on a minute, yeah, we get this. We understand why you would want your practices to be transparently fit for valid purposes. And yes, we want that too, because the alternatives are unacceptable. However, what about everything else? Surely all our organization's practices should be TFVP, should they not? And this gives you a great opportunity, because when people are presented with new practices, they can respond, generally speaking, in one of 4 ways. Either they can say, yep, I'm good to go, happy to comply, and they just get on with it. Some people dig their heels in and go, don't want to play ball and so on. And they insist on trying to do things the way they used to do it. But now, of course, everyone's going to know that doing things in the old way is transparently unfit, because it is transparent and they're never going to get away with that. The third possibility is that some people will look at a new practice and say, this is all very well, but over in this part of the organization, it isn't going to work because, and then they start explaining the reasons why it's not as TFVP in that part of the business as it would be somewhere else. And so, because everybody's got blind spots, so even if you're as diligent as possible putting these things together, you may still miss something, which means you need to give people the opportunity to contribute to making them even more transparently fit for valid purposes. Of course, the game plan or the rules of the game when doing that is that they have to show you their workings out. Otherwise, people won't be able to share justifiable confidence in the changes that you're making. That's just how it needs to be done from now on. And then the fourth possibility is where people are perfectly prepared to do it. They'd like to follow the new practices, but they don't feel they've got what it takes to do it, which means you need to have a practice in place which can capture that. This means that the internal communication team have to go first with making their practices TFVP before any others are going to work, for a couple of reasons. First of all, because you need your language standards to be TFVP, because every other practice is going to be couched in language. And if the language itself is not transparently fit for valid purposes, they're on a hiding to nothing before they go anywhere. But the other thing is to be able to support people when they feel they need help to put these things into practice. And this is where we came up with something we call the SMARTED feedback system, which we came up with back in 1996, and it still works. So we're very pleased with this. And this is a way of getting you even more leadership influence by being able to support every other business practice through the way in which feedback is actually managed. Because as you well know, you can communicate with people till you're blue in the face, but it doesn't mean they're actually going to do what's being asked of them unless they have all the resources they need to do it. So what resources might people need? Well, first of all, they're going to need to have the skills to do what's being asked of them. Otherwise, they're likely to mess it up or take far longer than necessary or treat it as a tick box exercise. Sometimes, occasionally, people might even need some new budget to do what's being asked of them. So that's something else that we need to take into account. You tell people to do stuff and say, well, I haven't got the time, I haven't got the people to do this. Unless you give me more people, I need more money, whatever. Sometimes people need to know, or very often they're going to need to know what their authority level is. How much discretion do they have over this new practice? What are the things they can decide for themselves? What are the things they have to follow? So authority is very much discretionary. Responsibilities also need to be clear, and they are, we would say, non-discretionary. And both of those need to be clear in people's minds so they will do things in the way that's being asked of them. On top of which, people also need to know they've got the time to do it. You introduce a new practice and someone might say, well, it's all very well, but I'm stacked out with stuff as it is, and you want me to do this other thing as well? Something's got to give. So we need to know that people have got the time to do what's being asked of them, especially if it's a change in their behaviors. We all know it takes time for people to get used to doing things in a slick way. So that could be an issue. And of course, people also need to have the right information and to know that that information is traceless. Imagine they're working with information which is incorrect or which is incomplete, or then it's going to be problematic. So the information has to be traceless. And very occasionally, with new practices, people may need even some new equipment. We had a situation a few years ago with a client introducing new security procedures they wanted people to follow. And as soon as they introduced them, about a quarter of the staff put their hands up, say, hang on, can't do this, because one of the instructions was when you leave your desk, you need to lock away your laptop. And people were saying, in what? We haven't got anything to lock it away in. So, it's all very well communicating about this, but if people haven't got the basic kit to do it, it ain't going to happen. Now, it could be said if people have got the skills, money, authority, responsibility, time, information, and equipment, they have got the ability to do what's being asked of them, on top of which they also need the desire. And this was where we put it together in 1996. This is where we left it. And there's something nagging away at us for years and years and years, and we just refused to look at it until 2010, in fact, when we went back to the issue of desire, knowing that, well, hang on a second, what's going on? It's a bit abstract, isn't it? How are we to know that people have got the desire? So we looked at it again, and we realized that there were three different aspects to this. First of all, the most obvious, perhaps, when it comes to desire is answering the question of, well, what's in it for me? If you can tell people that, then you're probably doing pretty well with their desire. But sometimes there's nothing in it for them personally. Sometimes it's about being able to support others better. So it's actually appealing to their sense of contribution and fulfillment, and I'm making a difference in the world, whether it's colleagues or it's customers or whoever. So that's a second source of desire. And we wanted to leave it there, but there was a third thing that was just nagging away, and we didn't dare write it down for yonks until we thought, you've got to bite the bullet here, because we know that if people are feeling they're being pushed outside their comfort zone, chances are they're not going to feel great about doing something. But we didn't want to write it down because we thought, how on earth can you deal with that? How on earth can an internal communication work? And we stared at it for weeks and weeks and weeks until we realized that the answer was also staring straight back at us, just as it's staring straight back at you now. So if you think about it, and this was the first time we used the phrase justifiable confidence, people's comfort zone comes from them having justifiable confidence in all of those other SMARTED resources. If you think about it, if people have got justifiable confidence in their skills, in the amount of time they're going to be given, the information they're using, all of that, then of course they're going to be inside their comfort zone. So this little model is incredibly useful. First of all, for helping people to identify what they need, because it actually gives a permission structure to everybody so that people don't feel they need to have to, fake it till they make it. They can just put their hand up immediately. It's not only allowed to say, I need help, it's expected of people. This is what we want you to do. Tell us what you need. And then, of course, the system needs to provide that. So it's not just as straightforward as asking people for feedback. You need to have the infrastructure sitting behind it. But that's a way of increasing everybody's sense of psychological safety, which is a really helpful thing to be able to do, and a way for you to be able to, again, increase your influence with your leadership team. So once you've got these smarted resources when you're first designing your practices, enabling you to sort of say, okay, to put these into practice, what are people going to need? Then, of course, you need to inform all the interested in parties, at which point they may well come back to you and say, well, actually, I also need this or I need that. So the smarted feedback system is an iterative process. And that's why when you embed your new practices, you need to review them on an ongoing basis to make sure, first of all, they're still delivering, and secondly, that everyone's got the resources they need to actually do it. So this is the 7-step action plan that we're advocating. But we did say earlier that we need to look at the question of prioritizing. So what are the priorities for the practices that we're suggesting you review? And there are 4 that we would say are really good idea to start with. The first of them being your language standards. We've already talked about the fact that if people are using inappropriate language to design new practices, the practices themselves are not going to be TFVP. So it has to start there, whether it's with your own practices or anyone else's. Language standards must come first. Even if you don't have any at the moment, it's probably a good idea to start thinking about what they should be. Then we would say move on to the briefing process and the feedback systems. And finally, as far as the priorities are concerned, your channel mix. Why are we saying these 4? Well, because think about it. Just imagine you've got these 4 and they're all transparently fit for valid purposes. You would then be in a position to start pretty quickly sharing them with those line managers who are crying out for help. And in doing that, you would be able to significantly increase the impact that you're able to have from this to this and this. This is why we're suggesting that those 4 practices would be the place that you should start. And this is the action plan that we're suggesting you can follow in order to get there. So this then raises the question of, okay, how do you feel about it? How do you feel about this action plan? Does it strike you as, oh, well, it's just an interesting academic idea, or is it something you actually feel you could use? Because if you're not going to use it, then you kind of, what's the point is the question. So rather than just sort of treat this as an academic exercise, just spend a moment, just pause for a second, look at this and go inside and think, okay, do I feel justifiably confident I could actually do this? And if you do, brilliant, fantastic, go for it. We will be more than happy to sort of hold your coat and cheer you on from the sidelines with a hearty, you go girl or boy or whatever. Fantastic, brilliant. But what if your answer is, not quite sure if I feel justifiably confident or not? Okay, that's why we decided it would be a good idea to put together some kind of support for you so you could feel justifiably confident in taking that first step. Journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. Journey of 1,000 miles begins productively with the first step, as long as that first step is in the right direction. So how could we help you make sure that it is in the right direction? And for this, we put together something, well, you could call it a workshop, but it's actually more like a spa day. Do you ever take yourself off for a spa day? A bit of sort of self-care, bit of nurturing, pampering. That's the kind of thing we want for you and your teams, the kind of vibe that we think would be really good for you to be able to nurture your own career and that of your team. So we put together this, what we call a career spa day for you and your team, which you're more than welcome to sort of talk to us about if it sounds like something, oh, yes, that sounds kind of groovy. And when you go off on a spa day, you get all these different treatments, don't you, that you can have. And so what we put together is 4 different treatments, 90-minute treatments to pamper your team and to nurture you and your career and their careers as well. And the idea behind these 4 treatments is that they will provide you with a super simple way of putting together your initial business case and your action plan. So you feel really supported and nurtured and looked after to put all that together. So you end this day essentially with everything you need to get everything you want for the rest of your career. That's the idea of this spa day. So what are these 4 treatments that we could take you through? The first thing, when you go to a spa, of course, you've got to do the deep cleanse, haven't you? Get all the gunk out, all the garbage. Yeah, okay, so we'll do that by helping you to map a new career trajectory for yourself. And the method of this is, well, it's very simple. There are 4 steps. First thing we do is we simply get all of your current niggles and frustrations out in the open. What is everything that's driving you and your team nuts? All the if onlys and why does this have to happen, and all these kind of why am I not allowed to, and why do I have to do X, and all of the things that are just driving you up the wall. We'll get them all out in the open so we know what they are, the things that you would really like to change. And we will also look at the impact these things are having on you and your clients and your organization. You know, everybody's no one's going to be winning from these things after all. We know that. So what is the impact? And let's get clear about all that. So we start to get a sense of, you know what, we really have justification for changing these things. And then we'll turn them on their heads and say, okay, so if you don't want all those niggles and frustrations, what do you want instead? What's your ideal alternative reality? The game plan, where do you actually want to get to in the end, where you have all the leadership influence you want and desire and all the resources you want, and what's in it, not just for you, but what's in it for your leaders, what's in it for your clients, what's in it for your organization. Let's get all of this out in the open so we can see it all and we can know, yes, this is what we want to do and this is why we want to do it and this is why it's a great idea to move forward. So that's treatment 1. And then treatment 2 is about enabling you to have a far greater sense of justifiable confidence in what you're really worth, in your impact, your potential to make a huge difference. So this is where we're going to enable you to realize your untapped potential by doing essentially a bespoke version of that IC financial audit, that dry run financial audit that we shared with you earlier. Only this time it will be tailored to your organization. So your employee groups, number of hours that they are spending. You can do these sort of fantasy surveys in your own mind and come up with a series of figures which are relevant to your organization. Now, of course, it's a dry run. It's not doing the actual surveys themselves. However, what we find fascinating is that when people share even the results of their fantasy dry run version with their leadership teams, those leadership teams tend to respond in one of 2 ways. Some of them say, okay, we get the idea. This is all very well. Now, go off and do it properly. Do the survey so we know what the real numbers actually are, so we can take an informed decision based upon what's going on in our organization, not based on your guesswork. Even though it's informed guesswork, you know, we need to see the real numbers. And that's fine, because that's sort of, okay, we can take the next step forward. But oftentimes we find that leadership teams will look at it and say, okay, we get it, sold. We don't need to see any more, because they get the idea of the ratios between the amount of money that's going down the drain at the moment and the relatively tiny investment that would be needed to make a big difference to those. So sometimes they don't even need to see the survey results. They're just happy to go with it as it is. Either way, you're kind of winning. So that's the idea behind treatment number 2. So you can come into treatment number 3 knowing, hey, guess what? Because you're worth it. That's it. And treatment 3 is about total self-indulgence. Well, not necessarily self-indulgence, but total indulgence for yourself, your team, and in fact, your entire organization, because this is where you build your wish list of everything that you and your clients and everyone else is going to need to be able to make it happen. We need to know what these things are. So let's first of all go back to the gunk that we picked out in session number 1, looking at all those current issues, and we need to get to the causes. What is it that's making that stick in place at the moment? Because it's already all knowing that it's there and knowing the impact it's having, but what's making it be there in the first place? So let's say, for example, you've got a situation with clients who keep saying, oh, I don't know what I want, but I know it's what I want when I see it. Oh, brilliant, thanks. Okay, well, in that case, what's causing that? Is it that it's someone sometimes gets responsibility dumped on them from their boss, so they don't really know what they should be asking for anyway? Well, that's not acceptable. Or could it be that the briefing process, the questions you've got, they're not actually as sharp as they could be or as comprehensive as they could be to get all the information, to make it as easy as possible for people to identify what they want? Or could it be, no, actually the briefing questions are fine. Unfortunately, some members of the team aren't as skilled as they need to be at using those questions. That's another possibility. Or could it be, no, the questions are fine, our skills are fine. It's just that we've got clients who will not play ball, who just ride roughshod over the process because we don't have a mandate to stop them, so they can continue to play the old, oh, I've only got 5 minutes kind of job. Well, that's, again, another issue that needs to be addressing. So what we'll do is go through every single one of your issues, and we'll look at what is the cause behind each of those. And it might be just one, it might be all of these, it could be some other things. We need to get it all out in the open so that then we can look at what are the resources that you need to remove that cause. So let's say, for the sake of example, it were just that your team need to up their skills. Okay, cool. So what might be missing here? Might it be they don't have all the business knowledge that they need? Maybe they're working in some parts of the business where they don't understand what's going on well enough that if a client comes out with an inappropriate answer, well, they don't have enough context. Your team don't have enough context to know that that answer isn't appropriate. That could be one issue. Or it could be that maybe when you work it through, actually, some of the questions aren't as clear or as precise or as comprehensive as they could be. Maybe that is what needs to happen. Or maybe members of your team need some technical training to get better at using the questions they've got. Perhaps they just need you to hold their hand for a bit longer. Maybe that's something that needs to happen, or perhaps they don't need that. They just need more time to practice. So what we would do is identify everything, every resource that's missing, so that you can then say, right, we now know everything we're going to need in order to be able to deliver TFVP practices across the piece. And then we can move on to treatment 4. You always get a goodie bag, right? Takeaway. So what are your takeaway goodies from this session? Well, what we'll do here is basically create the business case and action plan based upon what we've done in the previous treatments. So we will take the results of treatment 2, where you understood your untapped potential, put it together with the results of your wish list. So what are all the investments you're going to need? And we'll basically be able to say, okay, what are the necessary investments? And given our untapped potential, what would the ROI be likely to be, with a very important caveat? Because in the space of this particular session, it's inevitable that you may identify particular resources where you won't know immediately what the investment needs to be. It may be a case of, oh, we need to talk to IT about, getting that, or we need to talk to learning and development about training, or whatever. So it may be that you need to also gather some additional information in order to be able to complete the picture, which means that you can go away with a to-do list of, these are all the things we need to do in order to make this happen. This is the Career Spa Day that we have put together, which we hope you would find useful. And the idea is that you come away from that session knowing, number one, where you're at, and having justifiable confidence. We know where we're at. We have justifiable confidence in where we're trying to get to. And we know our untapped potential, and we know the investments we're going to need. We know all the resources we're going to be looking for, and we can put together a credible ROI and a credible business case for our leadership team to take this forward. So if that sounds like something that you'd be interested in, then it sounds like, yeah, that sounds like a fit for me and my team. Then send us a DM. We'd be more than happy to talk to you about how we can facilitate this for you. If we were doing it in person, it would be in a single day. If we were doing it online, it would be 4 individual sessions, because it's not very nurturing to spend 6 hours online in a single day, is it? So we would do it as separate sessions if that was the way you wanted to play it. And if you've got any other questions about anything we've shared with you over the course of this session or any of the other sessions, then again, send us a DM. And if you have enjoyed anything that we've shared with you, then please leave us a comment on LinkedIn and share these sessions with your network, because the more people who can do this, the more people who can get what it takes to have all the leadership influence they want, the better. Because as we established in session 1, internal communication pervades and influences the quality of every other business activity. And therefore, the better you can make the raw material with which people are thinking and feeling about their work, the better the quality of the thinking and feeling they can bring to that work, the better the quality of that work, and the better the impact they can have on the people their organization serves, which means you are in a position to start making a difference to improving the quality of life of effectively everybody on the planet, whether they go to work or not. Certainly everybody that your organization touches as a starting point. And that, we feel, is something that surely everybody should want you to be able to do. We would love you to be able to make it happen. So if you'd like to make it happen, drop us a DM and let's do it. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll catch